Hello. My name is Matthias Königer-Kibuji. I'm an associate professor here at LSE, and I would like you to welcome to this event. If you're not a staff or student at LSE, to welcome to LSE. We also have several people joining us online. So I will be chairing this event, and I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing the speakers. A couple of points, more practical points beforehand. In case there is a fire alarm going off, the assembly point is outside of this building on the side of Lincoln's Inn Fields, so not Kingsway, Lincoln's Inn Fields. Just outside you see the field, and there is an open area there. Okay, so we assemble there in case of a fire alarm going off. You are very welcome to tweet about the event, but I would also ask you to put your mobile phones on silent. And also to say that this is an event organized by the Global Health Initiative here at LSE, which is an interdepartmental research group that works on various aspects of global health, putting together expertise of various disciplines. So if you're interested in this, please have a look at the website of the Global Health Initiative. So I'm now going to introduce the speakers, but I will do so very briefly to leave enough time for both the event itself, the speakers themselves, but also for your questions and your comments at the end. So we are here to discuss a book by Dr. Benjamin Black. The title is Belly Woman, Birth, Blood, and Ebola. It's about the impact of humanitarian catastrophes on pregnant women. Dr. Black is a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist. He's based in London and is a specialist advisor to international aid organizations. He has worked for various humanitarian agencies, including MSF, Doctors Without Borders, as well as government departments, academic institutions, and UN bodies. His focus is on sexual, reproductive, and maternal healthcare population in crisis. And through the COVID pandemic, he has offered frontline healthcare to pregnant women and supported development of international guidelines. So we are very lucky that to have Michaela Wrong here, and she will be interviewing Dr. Black. She is a British author and freelance journalist with many years of experience covering Africa, and she has written 5 books, the latest of which is Do Not Disturb, which is published by HarperCollins, and which provides a critique of the rule of Rwanda by President Paul Kagame. So I think we are probably in this kind of interview phase for maybe about 3/4 of an hour and so on, and then we also open the floor to questions and comments, both from people here in the room and from people online. So please, Michaela, start.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be here. Thanks for coming, everybody. Just so that you know why I'm here, I met Ben a couple of years ago. He reached out to me saying, how do you get a book published? How do you get, do I need a literary agent? And because I'm a journalist who's had 5 books published, I often get asked this question by people. So we met in the park and had a long chat. But usually when I have those kind of chats and give the sort of a rundown of what I know, then, you know, I never see the person again. Whereas with Ben, it's been very nice. We've become friends. It turned out we lived quite close to each other in North London. And I think the thing that's really impressed me, and I think these qualities come across in the book, is this incredible determination that he's always showed at every stage of his career. And he showed the same determination about getting published. And along with that goes this thing, amazing empathy and also an intellectual curiosity, which I think are 2 of the qualities that shine out of this book. So it's lovely, beautiful cover, and I encourage you all to buy it as you leave. because it'll give you a great deal of insight. I thought I just touch on my experiences with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. So I'm a journalist. I've worked a lot in Africa, but I did also work before in places like Romania, France, Italy, and on the border between Kurdistan, between Turkey and Iraq. And I think that was probably the first time I saw MSF in action, was when Kurds were pouring into the mountains of Turkey from Iraq, where they had been bombed by Saddam Hussein in 1991. And they'd set up, the Turks weren't letting them into the country, so they'd been forced to set up massive refugee camps in the mountains, in the snow and in the mud, and this sort of really awful, difficult conditions. And I was a journalist, and I was spending all my time walking up and down those slopes, and there was nobody there at the beginning. And what, as a journalist, you realize is that when a crisis first develops, it happens so fast, there's nobody there. There are no doctors, no food was being distributed, people were getting sick, the water wasn't clean, all the kids had diarrhea, they were hungry, they were cold, they didn't have proper tents. And the one, I remember sort of passing this collection of white tarpaulin tents and just seeing one flag flying, and it was MSF flying. And you'll be familiar with that red logo that they use. And I sort of thought, that's impressive, you know, because there wasn't anyone else there. I think there was maybe the Turkish Red Cross was there and MSF, but no one else was there. And I've seen MSF in action in other places, in Eastern Congo, then Zaire, when the people were rushing out of Rwanda following the genocide, and these huge, vast settlements were formed along the border there, these refugee camps again. Then there was a cholera outbreak, and MSF was very active then, so were many other NGOs. But one of the things that has always distinguished them, they're very proud of, is their record, of course, of speaking out. And so one of the remarkable things in that circumstance was those camps were being used. Eventually, they became very militarized, those camps, and were being used to train people. Fighters who had taken part in the genocide were retraining, rearming, and they were being fed by the international community via the NGOs, via the World Food Programme. And the MSF was one of the organizations that said, we will not be a party to this. And they pulled out at a certain stage. So they go in fast, they're very effective, they speak out when they see things they're not happy with. And they're also brave. In Tigray, in Ethiopia, just recently, 2021, 3 MSF workers were killed, shot, their car came under a barrage of gunfire. We don't know who was responsible for that. They're all dead. And the Ethiopian government isn't showing any sign of wanting to investigate. That's my experience of MSF as a journalist, and obviously Ben has had the insider experience of working for them as an actual doctor and obstetrician. So I thought if you could just give us a very brief rundown of, you know, why you wanted to become a doctor, and then why you got into MSF, because I know you told me before that initially you didn't want to work for MSF. And I know it's not, you know, it's not your full-time job. It's something you do alongside your NHS career as an obstetrician.
Sure. So thank you everyone for being here. And sorry to those of you that I've got my back to. It's not the best view of me. So yeah, absolutely. So I suppose first of all, why did I become a doctor? Well, actually, I always wanted to work in humanitarian assistance or development aid. Growing up in the 1980s, and if you read the book, you'll know my family background is that I am a descendant of refugees and of people who have had to, on both sides of my family, had to either flee conflict, genocide, pogroms, and make difficult journeys and difficult decisions, and often had to rely on strangers to give them safety and to find ways to be safe. And I knew that was a type of work that I wanted to go into. And so I did what many people do when they're about 15, and I spoke to my school's careers counsellor and I said, well, I want to be an aid worker. And they told me, so that's why I became a doctor. And actually, in reflection, and as I've sort of gone through this journey of working in different contexts, it's very clear to me that if you want to understand humanitarian crises and how we can respond and support the populations affected, knowing about medicine isn't necessarily going to help understand the situations before us, because they are largely political and economic crises as opposed to medical crises. They result in medical crises, but that's not usually where they begin. And so that's why I've sort of taken a slightly twisty journey, because I've done medicine, but then I've gone to work in the humanitarian sector, realized that I need to know more. I went back actually to study political economy, and then specialized in obstetrics and gynecology. And obstetrics and gynecology maybe isn't the first specialty that you think of when you have this image of a medical aid worker. It's interesting when you ask people what that image of a medical aid worker is, because it's often very different from the reality. The reality is that most medical aid workers are local population. They're the first responders. They're the ones who stay the long haul. But it's not necessarily what we imagine. And I hadn't necessarily thought that obstetrics and gynecology was that's where I'm going to focus. Like, well, I'll do emergency medicine or maybe anesthetics. But my first real encounter in humanitarian response was working with refugees moving from Burma, Myanmar, into Thailand. There's huge refugee camps there. They've been there for now coming up to 80 years. But when I was there, they'd been there for about 50 years. And what became apparent to me very quickly was that the sexual and reproductive health needs of that population, as is true for all populations impacted by humanitarian crises, was staggering. And I was completely naive to that. I was very ignorant to that. I hadn't ever stopped to think about what happens for the sexual and reproductive health needs of the population when everything around them falls apart. And that experience of every day looking after adolescent girls coming in with sepsis or internal injuries from unsafe abortions as a result of sexual violence, or having to sell themselves to feed themselves, the experience of looking after newborn babies that have been born in the jungle as the family has had to flee and coming in with neonatal tetanus, really opened up my eyes to the huge public health and clinical health needs for sexual reproductive health. So that's how I ended up where I am, doing the work that I do now.
Okay. By the way, if you're having problems hearing up there, there are lots of seats down here. That's the whole row here. Feel free to fill the seats. So the book, it doesn't only talk about the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, but that is sort of the kernel of it. You went there in 2014. I was in Sierra Leone in 1992 covering a coup, one of many. And I remember its staggering beauty, that it's a sort of extraordinary sort of blue sea, and then these hills plunging into the water, and a rather cute, picturesque town. When you first went there, you had no idea that there was going to be an Ebola outbreak. So when did that sort of realization that there was a major epidemic on your doorstep set in?
Yeah, so I went going to Sierra Leone in 2014 was my first mission with MSF, my first placement with MSF. And I went not because of Ebola, as Nicholas says, I went because at that time, Sierra Leone had been listed by the World Health Organization as the country with the highest maternal mortality rate in the world. And so before Ebola, so mid-2014, the estimate was that if you were a 15-year-old girl living in Sierra Leone, you had a 1 in 17 chance of dying during childbirth. And so MSF had a large referral center for complications of pregnancy, and I was sent to be part of that project. And actually, Ebola had started, but it was on the border with Guinea when I first went out. And I knew about it, and I spoke to MSF about it, and the feeling was, not just for MSF, but generally, that Ebola doesn't tend to spread. It tends to get into a remote area and there'll be a response and it'll burn itself out, but it doesn't get into urban areas. It doesn't take swathes of a country or a region. And so really, don't worry about Ebola, and worry more, in fact, about Lassa fever, which is another viral hemorrhagic fever, which was endemic in the area, and also was something for us to think about. So when I first arrived, you know, as I came into the country, there was no posters saying Ebola or anything like that, as would be later. There was no one checking my temperature, there was no one asking questions. But once I arrived in the hospital, very quickly, it became clear that this was going to be, Ebola was going to be a huge part of what we did, because within my first shift, we started to receive pregnant women who had signs and symptoms that were suggestive of Ebola. And Ebola's, well, you'll know from the book, when you have Ebola, the signs and symptoms, they're very non-specific. But to make your suspicion, to say, I suspect this person has Ebola, you look for certain things, and those might be bleeding with an infection, with a miscarriage or an intrauterine fetal death, like a stillbirth, seizures, exhaustion, unconsciousness. And if you're providing maternity care in Sierra Leone, particularly then, when it takes a woman maybe 3-4 days to reach the hospital when she's in labor unobstructed, or having had to procure an abortion outside and become incredibly infected, all those symptoms are what were our bread and butter. And so it became very quickly apparent that for us to know whether or not the people attending our facility had Ebola or didn't have Ebola was going to be very challenging. And so really it began to dominate very early on. And as time went on and the dominoes started to fall, more and more cases of confirmed Ebola became closer to us, surrounding us, within our department, amongst our colleagues. And so began a 2-year journey through what would be the biggest epidemic in history.
I think one of the things I found really striking was your description of what it's like to treat a patient who has Ebola, the precautions you have to take. I mean, just you're in a hot tropical climate and you're having to wear the hazmat suit. I'm not sure if that's the right phrase, but describe a bit what that's like, because I mean, that really comes across in the book, how hard it is just to function normally, let alone act as a doctor when you're wearing that.
Yeah, I think now one of the benefits of the COVID pandemic is that a lot more people will know what it's like. If I say, you know, being in PPE for a long period of time and trying to do concentrated tasks. The PPE that we were wearing for Ebola was much more than the PPE that people would talk about during COVID. That's not to downplay the discomfort of the COVID PPE, but it was a much more intense. Plus, it was in West Africa, which is much hotter than the UK, or an air-conditioned intensive care unit. Has anyone ever been snorkeling? Anyone had that experience of snorkeling? Some nodding. Okay, so imagine you're snorkeling. Imagine you're stuck snorkeling. And at the same time, okay, so you're thinking about, if you just remember, you're thinking, I don't want the water to go down the tube. I don't want, you know, I can see, but I can't really see because it's a bit hazy because the clouds just went over the sun. I snorkel a lot, you can tell. And maybe your goggles don't quite fit, and every now and then a bit of seawater gets in and it stings your eye, but you can't just pop up because your friend's over there or you're seeing something interesting. And you're sort of trying to do lots of different things at the same time, as well as sort of think about your own well-being. Now imagine that, and also having a scalpel that's very sharp in your hand and being told, I want you now to perform life-saving surgery. Okay, so that's what it's like. Because I was very, very hot. I was sweating profusely. As you can see, for those of you who can't see me, I'm quite a short person, and all of the personal protective equipment was made for big people. Okay, so I was like wearing a huge gown. In fact, I'd have a step so that I could reach. And even on the step, my gown would flow across the floor. Okay, and at the same time, I'd be trying to do surgery and I'd be sweating so much that there would be sweat filling inside my goggles. So it really would almost be like surfacing in the swimming pool. And I would end up operating towards the end with my head to a tilt to try and stop that from going into my eyes. Whilst thinking, I really hope this woman's going to survive. I really hope that they don't have Ebola or Lassa fever, because I can't really see the end of my needle and I can't really feel the tissue that I'm trying to pull together.
Because they're using really thick gloves. You're only using two pairs of gloves.
2 pairs of gloves. The second pair, they didn't really fit me. And so actually, so it was very challenging. It's very hard to concentrate. But also lots of learning that comes from that. And, with COVID and with future Ebola epidemics that I've supported on, one of the things that I've taken from that is never underestimate the comfort of your healthcare worker, because there is danger in being too cautious, having too much personal protective equipment, when actually you can't breathe, you can't see, you can't feel, you can't concentrate. And we had cases in the Ebola treatment centres of people fainting. Well, that's pretty dangerous.
You mean the staff?
The staff fainting because they get too hot. And so, really, that's not a good idea in an Ebola treatment centre to fall on the floor. So yeah, challenging.
So I was struck by the bits in the book where you talk about the fact that some of your colleagues, MSF colleagues, Westerners who've gone out there, caught Ebola and died of it. And I think that's the first time, you said it, that's the first time in MSF history that's happened, that situation's happened. But also what came across I found slightly shocking is that they didn't behave that altruistically when they realized they'd caught it, because they knew as well as anyone how infectious this was and how much danger they were putting colleagues in, but they kept it to themselves in several cases.
Yeah, so there's different, within the book there are certainly stories, and everything in the book's true, of friends and colleagues who got infected with Ebola. For those of you who don't know much about Ebola, at that time, because of course things changed, but at that time Ebola had no vaccine, it had no treatment, and the mortality, the chance of dying with Ebola was very high. And at the beginning of the outbreak, for a general population, it was about 70% death rate.
Which compares to COVID is
much.
Yeah.
And actually for pregnant women, it was thought to be about 90%. Now that changed as the epidemic moved forward, but that's where we started from. So I think that I spent a huge amount of time obsessing about what's going to happen when I get Ebola. Okay, I would constantly be checking my temperature and constantly feeling hot and sweaty because I was working in West Africa and getting in and out of PPE, and always thinking, shit, it's actually happened. And I would often think, well, what will I do if I've got Ebola? Would I agree to go into the same treatment centre that I work in every day, where I, in the morning will be noting down the numbers of the individuals who have died during the night, the women, the children, the grown men? Would I want to be in that place?
Because that meant taking everyone, they were all in a separate area, weren't they?
They were all in the Ebola treatment centre.
Yeah.
But if I had Ebola, I would then have to go into the Ebola treatment centre. I'd have to be isolated. It's not a pleasant place to be. And so I think it's very, in some ways it's easy to judge, right? If I know someone that I live with has got Ebola or thinks they might have Ebola and hasn't told me, and they're living with me, and that puts me at risk, and it's very easy to be angry with that person. But it's also very easy to imagine, well, what would I do if it was me? What would I do if I was the one who had to think about calling my partner or telling my children or my parents that I've come here willingly and I've caught an illness which now leaves me with a 70% chance of dying? And I think that you can't underestimate the impact of fear and what that does to us as individuals and how that influences the decisions that we make. But just to clarify one thing with people who got infected. So for MSF has responded to a lot of Ebola outbreaks, even prior to the big one in West Africa. And up till that point, no one working for MSF, local health workers, which by far make the majority of people working for MSF, or international health workers had ever been infected by Ebola. But that did happen during the West African outbreak. Of the international aid workers who got infected, none of them died. But of our local colleagues, there were several who died. One of which I worked closely with, and I write about in the book, and you'll know about that if you read it. From other organisations, there were of course other infections, and one of those other organisations was someone that I was living with, who remained infected, knowing they were infected and symptomatic for about 6 days before telling us, and that of course was a tipping point, certainly for myself during this journey.
When you get a massive crisis like this, whether it's an Ebola outbreak or an earthquake, after an initial lag, then there's a sort of rush of NGOs, and that MSF flag is joined by many others. Concern, Goal, Save the Children, UNICEF, World Food Programme. And then there often comes a stage where the local government seems to have been shunted to one side. And admittedly, the local government often has played its part in the developing of that problem, because they either been underfunded, neglected, maybe there's been a problem with corruption. How did that work out in Sierra Leone? I mean, how did that tension between other NGOs and the government in place, the Sierra Leonean government, how did that pan out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's one of the many big lessons from this emergency. In many ways, it's a lesson that's been learned many times before and had to be relearned, and that is that the only organisation that is leading and is in charge is the government. It is that country. They're the boss. This is their country. It's their population. They know or should know what works, what doesn't work. And so outsiders, international organizations coming in gung-ho, coming in with a bit of arrogance, let's be honest, saying that they know best or they're going to take over, very rarely works. And really, it needs to be much more about this coordinated response, this, we're there if we're going, we're there because we're invited, because we're supporting, because we can be of benefit, but we're not there for ourselves. And I think one of the things that happens when you have lots of organizations coming in at the same time is that you get a little bit of, egotism. Suddenly everybody, they're there, they're spending money to be there, you want to be seen. And that can sometimes detract from the real purpose of why we're in this humanitarian response. Because, and it's...
Well, there's a bit of fundraising going on, really, because they want those flags to be seen on TV screens, because then they use that coverage to get funding later on. So
there's a tension there. There's a tension of fundraising, of media exposure, but ultimately, humanitarian response is at its core, it's to relieve suffering and it's to save lives. And if that's not your primary purpose, then you've got to question what you're doing in that emergency. And it is sometimes it feels like less is more. Sometimes there's so many voices involved. There's so many discussions. There's a lot of duplication, and sometimes that can be very harmful. And having a parallel system that weakens the national response is not going to do anything beneficial in the long term. And that's not, emergencies come and go. But for vulnerable countries, for fragile countries where they will be more prone to these humanitarian emergencies, once the acute emergency is over, there may be plenty of other health crises that are a little bit less sexy, but much more protracted going on. And in many ways, you could say that of the maternal health situation in Sierra Leone. I would argue that there was before Ebola, and there still is today, a humanitarian crisis in Sierra Leone, and that is maternal health.
The most dangerous thing to happen to a young woman in Sierra Leone can be to get pregnant.
Well, globally, for adolescent girls, pregnancy is still the leading cause of death. And certainly in Sierra Leone, that remains the case, of course.
And there were, I mean, after every crisis, there's always analysis of what happened, what was the best, you know, what mistakes were made. What's your analysis of what mistakes were made in Sierra Leone?
For the Ebola response, I think most people would probably agree that the biggest mistake was not listening enough to the population that was being affected. And I think that, again, if we look at COVID, we can see where that lesson maybe hasn't been learned. But one of the things that we really learned with Ebola was, you know, it affected every single aspect of your life. It wasn't just an infectious disease that has a clinical effect. A bit like COVID, you know, it impacted social structures, schools got closed, the way that you treat your loved ones who may have got sick or died was changed, the way that you access healthcare changed. And so trying to respond to all of that without intimate knowledge and understanding of what the population understood by what was going on, what the population felt they needed to feel safe and to be able to continue living. And of course, for them, Ebola was one of many competing priorities. They also need to feed their children, get their work done, live their lives. But without taking the time to listen or putting really the leadership role in local leaders who can communicate and speak and listen in ways much better than an international outsider can, was lost. And I think that because it took a long time for the penny to drop, we lost a lot of time in the response, and it meant we ended up playing catch up. And obviously, you know, for a long time, it really felt like we were chasing our tails, trying to get the trust of the community back again, and trying to make sure that the right people are in the right places. Like, you know, like I said, for COVID, I don't know about you guys, but I often felt with the messaging for COVID, you know, people on the TV didn't really speak to me. I don't want to listen to what Boris Johnson has to say from a lectern. And you know, so you think about the UK population, it took a long time before the messaging changed to being much more about local community leaders, different religious leaders, making sure it's in different languages, trying to engage with certain celebrities or icons, because people hear information in different ways and from different people. And if you don't trust the person that's giving you the information, then you're not going to trust the information. And this of course, was a huge problem in Ebola as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was going to ask you a bit more about that. I mean, we all tend to think there are other epidemics coming down the line, and you know, we've all now had experience of COVID. You've had this extra experience of working in Ebola. What would you like to see differently next time? If there was something like, you know, Zika or something in between, you know, for fatality, something in between COVID and Ebola?
Well, I think that ideally, we should be in a situation where we don't need to make huge changes every time there's some sort of epidemic outbreak. So if you think about sexual reproductive health, which is sort of the area that I focus on, you know, when COVID happened, there was suddenly this rush of, you know, we've got to make sure that abortion care can be accessed by telephone. We need to make sure that contraception can be received every time someone's leaving the hospital, or that there's, you know, maybe you can collect it from the pharmacy rather than have to see a doctor. All these changes that were made to cope with the sort of that wider aspect of the epidemic that frankly should have just been the way that we do business anyway. And I think that what we need to do is think ahead to, you know, what would be our ideal situation so that we don't have these big shocks, that we don't have to have these huge changes in the system every time, but that we have a much more resilient system that is able to weather the storm in a more straightforward way. Of course, communication, as I've said, it goes without saying almost, and the community engagement aspects. But clinically, I think it's thinking about much more flexibility, making sure that women and patients can access healthcare in lots of different ways. So self-care, putting the ownership in the hands of patients, and decentralized models of care, so that there's not so much emphasis on coming to health facilities when quite often you don't need to.
When you don't need to go in. Yeah. So Ebola's bubbled up a few times, hasn't it, in various different spots in Africa since you were in Sierra Leone. There was an outbreak in Eastern Congo, wasn't there, a couple of years ago? And then just recently there was one in Uganda. And I was watching that because I'm interested in Uganda, and I was watching it and thinking that is really, really scary, because it was on a main road, Mupende, which is on one of the big arteries in Uganda going straight into Kampala. So very easy for that virus to travel all the way into Kampala, very densely populated city. And it hasn't turned out into a big epidemic. What do you think the Ugandans got right? Because it seems that they've managed to grab it and sort of, crush it.
Well, I mean, the outbreak in Uganda is over officially.
Yeah, which is amazing.
So I think first of all, there's a lot of differences between what happened in Uganda and what happened in West Africa. The key difference is there's been Ebola outbreaks in Uganda before. So first of all, they were able to recognize much earlier that this was Ebola when it was a much smaller outbreak, and they also had the infrastructure to respond to it. In West Africa, there'd never knowingly been an Ebola outbreak, so it took a long time before it was identified. It took a long time before it was believed, because there was issues with community engagement. And of course, that infrastructure didn't exist as it did in Uganda. So they had the flex to be able to respond. I think that Ugandans, they did a lot of things right. They took leadership. The Ugandan government took a very clear leadership. There was no doubting that they were in charge, and that any NGOs that were coming to support the response were coming to support Ugandan Ministry of Health and Ugandan government in putting that outbreak in control. And so you had that leadership, you had that coordination, and you had much clearer community engagement, and a lot of course, locals, Ugandans, working with their communities and ensuring that that messaging was put forward. Of course, it wasn't perfect, but there is no perfect, and there was securitization of the response, which could be challenging. There were economic impacts, restrictions on movements. But certainly they did a lot of things that were... And
there is a vaccine for Ebola, but not against that strain, am I right?
So for that strain, there's a vaccine that's not yet proven to work. But for now there is a vaccine for the strain of Ebola that came to West Africa, and that was also in Eastern Congo. But that didn't exist for the West African outbreak. But what I think is interesting about the vaccines and also about the experimental treatments is who has access to them. So, if you remember, I said, if you're a pregnant woman at the beginning of the West African Ebola epidemic, then based on what we knew from previous outbreaks, as a pregnant woman, you had a 90% chance of dying, and your unborn baby had a 100% chance of dying, because there was no known recorded cases of the baby of a woman who's pregnant with Ebola ever surviving. And yet, when those vaccines were being trialled and started being offered to the population, who do you think was not included? Who do you think was not given the choice to accept that vaccine? And this was the same as well as with the experimental treatments. We didn't know if they were going to work or not, but the point is, it doesn't make sense to...
So it wasn't given to pregnant women?
No, the option was not there,
right.
because in standard clinical trials, often pregnant women are not included. And even, once you got towards the end of the outbreak, where what we found was, the overall mortality was about 50%, okay, just over 50%. And that was the same for pregnant women, actually, as it was for the general population. So there was no difference in the mortality rate. So you've got, your chance of surviving this disease was the flip of a coin, and yet you were not even given the option to take a vaccine that might protect you or might save your life. And so this is something which certainly has been learned from, and now pregnant women are included. And you've seen in COVID, again, it was a bit of a mess at the beginning, but pregnant women were quickly included in trials because it was recognized that if you don't include them, you don't get the data, you're not going to know how safe it is.
But there was a whole stage with pregnant women, because I had a friend who was pregnant. She wasn't given the COVID vaccine because they were worried that it might have an impact on the child.
And in fact, that worry, if you go back to communication and community engagement, we are still suffering the consequences of that confusion. And the same thing happened in Eastern DRC when the vaccine was being used. At the very beginning, they didn't want to include pregnant or breastfeeding women. And then very quickly, once a bit of discussion went on, it was decided, no, of course you've got to include them. It makes no sense not to include them. And also, just so you know, there's no evidence that these vaccines are at all harmful to pregnancy. So it was really over the top. But trying to crawl back from that confusion was incredibly hard. And once you planted that seed that there might be something that isn't quite right with this medication, this vaccine for pregnant women, it's very hard to then convince them that actually it's okay. But things are getting better. We're just finished a study in South Sudan looking at the hepatitis E vaccine. Hepatitis E is a virus which for most of us in the room would not be of much concern, but if you're pregnant, has a very high fatality rate. And that trial is actually really focused on making sure that we're vaccinating pregnant women to see how protective it can be.
Okay, so I sort of wanted I know you've been back to Sierra Leone, right? And you took some of the books. What was it like? Because on the one hand, it must be lovely to see the people you work with there, but also, what did you feel? Did you feel, oh, they're okay now? Medical system's working. It's in such, much better state. They would be able to withstand another epidemic if it were to occur. Or...
So I go back to Sierra Leone quite regularly. I go almost every year, and it's worth saying, look, I've written this book, but it's not my story alone. It's the story of all of my colleagues and the patients that I had as well. And my Sierra Leonean colleagues were all involved in writing this book. The names in the book are real, not the patient names, but the names of my colleagues are real because my colleagues all were very much behind making sure that this story is told and this story is shared. And so for them, they were, they're very proud that this book's been published. They're very proud that people can understand what they went through as a population and as healthcare workers, the risk that they took, as being a healthcare worker in West Africa, you had 32 times greater chance of catching Ebola than you did if you were part of the general population, and they stuck through it. I had the privilege of being able to get on a plane and leave anytime I wanted, and I did go back and forth, but they were living in it day in, day out, going to work, going back to their families, frightened, seeing people they knew and they loved getting infected and dying. And so being able to return this last time with copies of the book for them, obviously was a very touching moment for everybody.
Okay. So my last question is about the whole white savior issue, which I know preys on your mind. I was just watching a Netflix series, I think it was last night, and it was great because at a certain point they had the feisty divorcee played by Kathleen Turner, who's somewhere like Honduras, I don't know, Guatemala, who was vaccinating kids. And of course, she's an MSF doctor. And it occurred to me how often you see this image in the media. It's become the MSF doctors are kind of like, it's a touchstone label for someone who's a hero, a martyr, a saint. So as someone who is an MSF doctor, That must be, you must wince when you see those programs, but there is this sort of issue of, is this a form of paternalism? It's always north-south. Is it, we're talking about global health, but is it really a north-south transfer of knowledge without much input? I mean, how do you deal with these issues? Because I know you think about them all the time.
Well, there's no short answer. I'll try and keep it short. And I know that looking around the room, I know that I've got colleagues here who also worked with MSF and have got a lot of experience. Also thinking about and questioning this. So I think, humanitarianism, like everything, has its history. You can't escape history. That's how we got to where we are. But looking at the world today, we know, as I said before, that the greatest humanitarian actors in the world are not the MSF doctor that you described. They are the local population. They're often not people working for any NGO. They are the people who provide first response medical care, first psychological assistance, ensure that access to health structures come back again, that there's protection for women and girls in times of conflict. And, a lot of what we need to be thinking more and more about is, rather than having a world where not every time, but having a world where when there's a crisis, our automatic assumption and thought is we're going to send in the humanitarian responders. But then we have a world where we have countries which have access to the resources, the training, the systems that they can respond themselves with support if needed, but it shouldn't be that the support is an assumption that that's what that's the first part. In response to sort of the question about how did I feel about portrayal of white saviorism, you're right, when and of course we've spoken about it, when I started writing this book, I was acutely aware of all the books I've read before that have made me really cringe and made me very uncomfortable because the book is about the author. Now, there's no escaping that when you sit down to write a book, particularly if it's going to be based on your personal experience, that as the person writing it, you're going to take a central role in that. But that shouldn't detract from the fact that the story is not about me. The story is about my colleagues. The story is about the population. It's about the challenges we faced, the ethical decisions that we had to make, where quite often they were impossible decisions, where no answer was ever going to be right. And hopefully, for anyone who reads the book, that's what you'll take away from it. You won't take away from it, I'm going to say it, but saying that you won't take away from it that, oh, well, this guy's a hero, because that is not what I sat down to do. And I think there's a danger in that people often think, oh, you just, you want to be emulated. No, I sat and I wrote this book because this was a really, really important piece of history. And these are really important issues that are still very real today that should be spoken about and should be challenged, and hopefully to open up a discussion about what it is to be, in this case, a pregnant woman trying to survive through a humanitarian crisis.
Thanks very much, Ben. I think, should we open it up to questions?
Let's open it up to questions. Just a couple of points. So we are recording this meeting. Please keep that in mind. So it could be, it could become a LSE podcast. We will see. If you ask a question, of course, you are very welcome to tell us your name, but you don't have to. If you like, you could also tell us your program, your department, and other things about you. And of course, people who are following us online are also welcome to ask questions. In that case, I would ask, please, write them in the chat, and I will go over them, and I will, give as many people as possible online also the opportunity to ask questions. And just finally to say, as you know, Michaela is kind of has been covering Africa for a very long time and has written various books lately, the one on Rwanda. So if you've read her books or want to hear a little bit more about her experiences, please, we have time also for that, please. So don't worry about the issue of time. Okay, who would like to start? I might start with taking questions from the audience here in the room. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here and for talking to us. Can I just ask you quickly about the title of the book? Why Belly Woman?
Yeah, that's good. It's a good question, actually. So the reason the book is called Belly Woman, so Belly Woman doesn't mean anything. Okay, it's a title that's made up by me. But in Creole, which is one of the languages of Sierra Leone, the term for a pregnant woman is Belly Woman. And the root of that is that, Creole is a mix of English and local dialects. And so when I was writing the book, in fact, it was, anyone who's tried writing the book, you go through several titles in your mind. And this was sort of one that came later. And I was like, this is actually really what I want the book to be about, because the book is about the Belly Woman. In fact, my colleague Suma, who is in the book, is a colleague that I worked with in the Ebola treatment centers and a maternal health project. It was him who said, when I first approached him and said, I want to write about books, said, oh yeah, a book for the Belly Woman. They deserve it. It's our testimony for them. And so I took that, and then I just thought, it makes it's a good name for a book, and I thought it was a good. Then if you see sort of with the design, to make sure there's a woman with a big belly on the front of it. That's very good.
Yes, over there.
I was wondering whether any cultural obstacles you face.
So just in case anyone couldn't hear, just repeat, so if I faced any obstacles, cultural obstacles being a white man treating women. In Sierra Leone, I'm going to give you a sort of a bit of a double answer. So the short version of my answer is, in Sierra Leone, no, but that's because I don't know about them. Yeah, so there may be many cultural obstacles that I faced being a white man treating pregnant women in Sierra Leone, but they may not be told to me. They might be told to my local colleagues who will never share that information with me. It's very clear to me that I am in a position of power. Okay, whether I feel it or not, just by virtue of what I'm doing, I'm the doctor, and also of my appearance, that I hold certain powers, rightly or wrongly, and so not to me directly, but I'm sure there will have been. In other contexts, yes, but not specifically. No, I haven't.
Yes, over there, please.
Hi, my name's Rebecca. I work at BPAS. I guess I'm interested to hear about how you relate your experiences working for MSF back to your practice in the UK. And I think often we make things really more complicated and bureaucratic when delivering healthcare in high-income settings, more complicated than it needs to be, and involving a lot of sort of clinically unnecessary barriers to care. And I guess there's some quite obvious ones around abortion care. And I just wondered, is there anything from your time in Sierra Leone or anywhere else that you've worked that you think they do really well that we should consider adopting in practice in the UK?
So thank you very much. So just for those who don't know, BPAS, which is the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, the biggest abortion provider in the UK. First of all, I am going to answer your question, but just to mention that within the book, I talk quite a lot about abortion care and some of the challenges that we face providing abortion care in humanitarian settings, and also in more legally restrictive settings in the UK, because don't forget, the UK is also a legally restrictive setting for abortion care. In answer to your question, so there was two questions. One was how do I relate my work in, say, MSF setting, humanitarian setting, to UK, and then the one was about examples of how things can be done better, pulling examples across. So there's a lot of, so right now, the way that I work at the moment is half my job is providing direct clinical care in the UK in a high income setting, maternity care in London, and the other half of my job is still working as an obstetrician gynecology advisor to MSF, providing maternity and sexual reproductive health care in some of the least developed countries of the world and in humanitarian settings. And so I would say that every day I pull things across in both directions. There are things that I will do in North London, which I only do because I've had the experiences I've had working in the humanitarian sector. And I can see because I know some of the people in the room, I can see clinicians, obstetricians nodding because we all have that. There are certain, for those of you who don't regularly work on a labour ward, let me tell you what it's like. You never know what's about to walk through the door. You might think, well, everyone's just coming in and having babies. No, everyone comes in with something different because they might walk in hemorrhaging. They might walk in with undiagnosed triplets. They might walk in and say, I don't want any medical care at all. Just don't come near me. But you can see there's something really wrong. Okay, so you've got to think on your feet all the time. And the benefit of having worked in settings where I didn't have every investigation at my fingertips, I didn't have every other specialty that could call me and bail me out of trouble if I needed them, means that you have that added diversity in the way that you respond to the situations in front of you, and just gives you a little bit more in your backpack, As far as your question about, what do I think that humanitarian settings do well that can be pulled across, I think there's a huge amount. And I think that, one of the big things that I really felt the whole way through the COVID response in the UK was just how arrogant we were. I say we, not necessarily us, how arrogant our government was in its response compared to seeing how many of those settings, humanitarian settings, responded, because they're having epidemics on a regular basis, not necessarily Ebola, but cholera, diphtheria, malaria. They understand much better what it is to have quick response, community engagement, contact tracing, making sure that your services can be decentralized, that you can, send people out door to door and make sure that messaging is right. And we didn't get that. We didn't do that. And we talk about self-care, which is giving, empowering patients to be able to look after themselves and make their own decisions. And of course, abortion care is a great example of that, because in the UK, we only managed to really push that through using with COVID. But in many lower income settings where it's very difficult to reach a hospital, maybe it's very expensive, self-care is old news, and it's something which is being used a lot and is often being adapted. And there's still a huge amount that I think we can learn. Like I said, it goes in both directions. I put a lot of my high income work into my MSF work and vice versa.
So some hands going up in the room, but I'd like to go for a question online first. How did you get into working with an MSF, especially after having trained in the UK? Was there any extra training required? How did you find the process of adjusting to a different healthcare system? How do you balance a career in the NHS and MSF?
Okay, so how did I get into MSF is quite straightforward. If anyone's interested in working for MSF, this may sound particularly patronizing, but literally just go on the website and apply. Okay, MSF, that's how you get into MSF. MSF has lots of different roles, so it depends whether you're looking at a medical position, if you're looking at a logistical position, advocacy, anthropology. There's huge humanitarian work is huge, and although we're a medical humanitarian organization, doctors, nurses, midwives are just one portion of what we need to be able to work within the settings that we work. I didn't, so I can speak for clinical work in MSF. So to be a doctor working for MSF, you need to be able to work independently and competently, because you might find yourself, as I did, on your first shift dealing with a catastrophic emergency that you would normally have a very senior colleague come to help you out and not be able to call for that senior colleague to come and help you out. So you've got to think, when I go out to work somewhere, am I the right person to be there? Am I a safe person to be there? Can I get myself out of trouble? So it's not necessarily about additional training, but it's about having the right level of training, the right level of experience and competence. Some people will do additional training in tropical medicine, or they might do additional training in advocacy, but that's not an absolute. As far as how do I balance my work with NHS and MSF, or NHS in the humanitarian sector, I think the easier answer is to say that I don't. It's definitely out of balance. I probably spend far too much time trying to do everything.
But do they give you sort of leave of absence so you can go and work?
So not at the moment, no. So if I want to, so at the moment, so like everybody, I have my life pre-COVID and post-COVID, right? So my pre-COVID existence was a much more ad hoc arrangement. And so I would be able to go out to various projects, either with MSF or with organizations, for extended periods of time. And when I came back to the UK, I'd pick up work as a locum in different hospitals. Then, of course, COVID happened, and the way that I work changed, as it did for everybody else. And now, post-COVID, I have a much more formalized arrangement, which is much more difficult. It doesn't give me the same flexibility. And so most of my MSF work now is not in the fields, as you might call it, in the location, but it's supporting, and as you can now, supporting a lot through remote support. So even today, I have been in Central African Republic, Iraq, South Sudan, but I haven't had to leave my desk. I can have those conversations with my colleagues working and help troubleshoot and work on strategy. I might not be able to do direct patient care, but frankly, I don't need to do direct patient care because there's very competent clinicians in all those countries. So that's how I do it at the moment.
If I can put in a word here, the people at MSF that I used to really respect were not, in fact, the doctors, they were the logisticians, because the fact that flag was fluttering over this sort of muddy refugee camp on the slopes of Kurdistan was because someone had got trucks through, and they managed to get the supplies and the personnel and the visas and all the transport through customs. And I think MSF has the most brilliant logisticians in the world. They're so determined, and truck drivers, and they just pull it all together, and that network is really impressive. And that's as much part of the global health response as doctors, because you wouldn't be able to do your work without those supplies and those tents going up before you arrive.
Yeah, and to be honest, I'd say that it's a bigger part than doctors. And that's why I say when the advice I got and the role I play, a lot of it is actually about ensuring that there's access to healthcare through commodities, through systems, through transport. It's not about necessarily needing to send clinicians to places.
Thank you. So,
yes, thank you. So according to your experience, would you say that healthcare workers, the local ones, had a lot of say in how NGOs or international organizations acted there? Because we were also critically flagging that before.
So during the Ebola response, I think not enough, to be honest, and I think that's still true today. I think that we are not yet in a place where we should be, and that is where the local health workers are the ones that are telling us support systems if they need them, what they need and how they need it, and what are the best ways to work within the context that they are the experts in. And that, no, absolutely, in Ebola, they were not, certainly within MSF, the local healthcare workers were not the leaders in the decision making. And I think that is one of the big lessons that we take forward. And I think that's part of, when we talk about the decolonization of aid, it's about, who has the power, who makes the decisions, who's leading here, who does it matter to most? who knows the context best, and most often that is not going to be your international aid worker.
Rosie, I'm doing my PhD here, but my background's in humanitarian response. And I thought it was really interesting the way you talked about sexually reproductive health as this sort of acute, protracted humanitarian situation that will, you know, as Ebola or whatever comes and goes, is still there. But of course, it's often not prioritized by humanitarian organizations as a basic need. And other things are prioritized over it. So, and there's a lot of silence around it. So I guess your perspectives on sort of why the silence and what can be done about it. And I know, of course, MSF is perhaps an exception because it privately funded is able to act more independently. So yeah, just your thoughts on that.
So, so first of all, I absolutely agree. You know, maybe it goes without saying that I agree that there's not enough attention given to sexually reproductive health in humanitarian emergencies. And just, you know, I think we're quite a mixed group. You know, when we talk about sexually reproductive health, we're talking about, we're not only talking about the care of pregnant women, we're talking about a huge swathe of medical, social, psychological care, which is relevant to every single person in society. Okay, so men, women, young, old, LGBTQ. We're talking about contraception, abortion care, HIV, STIs, maternal and newborn health care, talking about cervical cancer. The list is huge. Okay, so it's a massive, massive subject. So why doesn't it dominate? And I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one is that there's an assumption that it's happening anyway, right? I think that a lot of the time, international organizations, it's like, that's our bread and butter. Of course, we're looking after all those things. And we get sort of sidetracked and tunnel vision into that that's not the emergency, right? We'll say, but the emergency is Ebola, but the emergency is that there's this conflict and there's war wounded. And what we forget, what we overlook, is that actually, whatever the emergency is, it's going to have a negative impact on every single aspect of that long list of sexually reproductive health. Okay, your gender-based violence and rape is going to increase. Your access to contraception is going to decrease. The number of women and girls needing abortions who can't get them, who then end up with unsafe abortions, and maternal deaths is going to increase. But because those dots aren't connected, the focus ends up being on something else. We get that tunnel vision. And I think the other reason why it's overlooked is because sexually reproductive health is largely silent, because culturally, we don't go around telling everyone about our sexually reproductive health needs. So gender-based, sexual and gender-based violence is hidden. Abortion is hidden. Your need for sanitary products is hidden. And so because no one's talking about it as loudly, it gets lost, I think that there was a report that was written, and I was, just full disclosure, I was one of the authors, but
still very good.
It was still very good. And it's called Not All That Bleeds Is Ebola. Which if you're interested in this idea of where's the emergency, I recommend reading it. It was from the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, from 2018 to 2020, which was a very complex humanitarian emergency. It was an Ebola outbreak, but also in a place of protracted humanitarian emergency. And what we were looking at there was, how has the Ebola response impacted the sexual reproductive health response? And what we found is, of course, that it largely made it worse. But a part of that was also this siloing of, but this is the Ebola emergency, and this is the other emergency, and one doesn't need to talk to the other. And this is a problem that we see time and again.
So some hands going up, but I'm taking now a question from the online audience, from Kate. Were there specific things that were helpful to support the mental health of the team, local or international, during Ebola?
I think that it's going to be different for each person, right? And the mental health is everyone responds in different ways to traumatic processes. There were during the emergency response, there were, at least for MSF, there were people that were sent out and working locally whose core role was mental health support and psychological first aid. But like I say, everyone responds differently, and if you, I write quite a lot about it in the book. The mental health toll that working for a long time in these emergencies can have, and sort of how we recognise burnout amongst one another, and how that impacts the work that we provide. But also that, like I said, that it doesn't, not one size is going to fit all, as if at MSF, when you immediately, as you're coming back from the response, you get to sit down with a psychologist. And for me, that just doesn't work. For other people, it'll work. And I write in the book about my experience of sitting with a psychologist, and how that turned out for me was that the psychologist found my experiences very, very traumatic. And she was crying, and she asked to finish our meeting early because it was so traumatic. But I was just not yet in a space that I recognised how traumatic some of it was, that I recognised my own feelings. So, you know, I know for myself, I work through writing, and actually my best therapy is writing this book, so I can share it all with you. But everyone's going to have a different way of coping.
Okay, I'd seen a hand going. Yes, just.
Quick one for you, Ben, and it's perhaps a slightly cheeky one. We've discussed this at length before, but not with the cameras running, so I hope you don't mind me asking this. But you talk about lessons learned from Ebola in Sierra Leone, and you talk specifically about community engagement being one of those big lessons learned. Both you and Michaela have referred to Ebola outbreaks that came after Sierra Leone, and much of the critique of the response in those contexts, each and every one of those contexts, has been that we can continue to fail to listen to people in those contexts. So I wonder if you might speak to what it is, as someone who has worked for and is still working for MSF, an organization that's always present during an Ebola outbreak, what's holding us back when it comes to actually learning those lessons?
Well, I think if I knew the answer, I'd probably be very famous. You know, what's holding us back from learning lessons? I think what we have is that we're really good at identifying lessons. I think that we're really good at wringing our hands afterwards and saying we should have done this, this, and this. But I think to actually learn lessons is something else. And so maybe I should correct what I've said, which is that really when I talk about learning lessons, I'm talking about identifying them, because I don't think that we often learn them. I think it takes a lot more effort and a lot more commitment to actually be accountable to going forward. That's not to say that we're not improving. And I think we are improving. I think that we are getting better. And I think now when there's an Ebola outbreak or a disaster, we're very quick to talk and engage with community, to listen more, to pull in anthropologists who can advise and guide us much earlier than we did in the West African outbreak. So certainly I think we're improving, but we haven't got it right, you know. I think that's still going to take time, and it's going to be something which challenges with every new context and every new emergency. So yes, I can't tell you how we're going to learn, because I don't think we know yet. If anyone in the room knows, please feel free to tell us the secret.
Yes.
I've asked this question to you before, also in a different context, but I think it's really important. So I think it's applicable to what happened in COVID and obviously in Ebola. So the norms of how we deal with death changed here dramatically as they did in Ebola. And one of the things that really struck me is the sort of religious and social practice of washing bodies. and how you relate that and how that couldn't be done in Ebola. So can you just talk a little bit about that and how it affected you?
Yeah. So I think that as much as we focus on the living, you cannot underestimate the importance of the care for the dead, and the respect that's involved in that, and the respect for the cultural practices. So for Ebola, just for those who don't know, when someone has Ebola, they become increasingly unwell because they're getting more and more Ebola virus. Their body becomes increasingly infectious. And by the time that they die, bearing in mind that Ebola is spread through body fluids, they will have vomited profusely, had diarrhea profusely. They may have been bleeding from their orifices. And so their body is encased in Ebola virus. And so having a practice that involves it keeping the body in your home or washing it or eating with it can be very, very risky, and that's why Ebola spreads so efficiently through relatives and families and close loved ones. And I talk a lot about that in Ebola, that Ebola will always go for those who love you most, because they're the ones who are going to be closest to you when you're sick and when you die. So, as much as we, from a clinical perspective, can understand that that's very high risk, telling someone's wife or children that they can't provide the care that they see as being respectful, being the right of that person that's died, that maybe is important for what happens to them in their afterlife, if that's something you believe in, is a huge thing to say to them. And that's why, again, this communication is really important. And I'll be honest, I don't think that I appreciated at all how important that was until sort of in the midst of all of this, I had my own family bereavement, and in my own cultural practice, we washed the body of the dead. And it was only when I was outside of the outbreak, back in the UK, with my own family, going through my own walk through that, and I thought, how would I feel if I was told that you can't be with this person whilst they're dying, you can't carry out the rituals which have been passed down from generation to generation and would have been incredibly important to that individual? Would I accept that? Would I do it secretly because it was too important to me to make sure that that respect was carried out? And my understanding of it shifted hugely, and my empathy shifted hugely. And for COVID, so I was working largely in the UK during COVID, clinically and then advising internationally. What I took from me with COVID was the importance of making sure that people in hospital, whether they had COVID or whether they were in hospital for other reasons, had access to visitors. And I think many of you will remember that there was a lot of restrictions placed, which, at least for myself, I felt was a huge lesson that hadn't been learned, going back to James's question, from these other responses, the importance of making sure that when someone you love is sick or has died, that you're able to see them and they're able to see you. And of course, in maternity care, one of the areas where that was very, very impactful was the access to pregnant women who were giving birth to have their chosen partners with them, not just at the time of birth, but for the whole of that pregnancy journey. Because it's very frightening. It doesn't matter if you're coming in to have an ultrasound scan or you've had your baby, but maybe you've had a cesarean section and you can't get up and look after the baby as easily as you might think you can. To have that support network with you, and to restrict that and to know that it's going to be restricted is likely to make you engage less with the health service, come later, high risk of complications, or stay away completely and potentially risk disaster.
I think I saw earlier hand going up on this side. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ziad. I'm doing a master's in health and background as a medical student. So I found it really interesting when you're talking about the political landscape of health, my question kind of was, as a doctor working in sort of dictated frameworks, whether that be the MSF or the NHS on COVID, from politicians say neglecting maybe people of color, communities who are at high risk of dying. How do you not get frustrated and sort of remain hopeful to challenge that status quo?
Well, I think it's a very good question. So when you're saying that, of course, my mind actually goes very much to the UK setting, where we know that in the UK, over the last few years, it's been very clear there's a huge disparity in maternal health outcomes, depending on whether you're a black, brown, mixed race, or white woman. Okay, and so for those who aren't aware, your chance of dying in childbirth in the UK, so in a high income setting, until recently was 5 times higher if you were black. It's now 3.5 or 3.5. So it has improved. So it's still atrocious. There's still a massive disparity. But your question is, how can I have hope? Well, because we can see that we recognize, so first of all, we're recognizing that there's a huge disparity. We're trying to understand it. And there's been in the last year several large-scale inquiries, and in particular, inquiries led from grassroots populations, led by, not by clinicians, but by Black women's groups and multi-ethnic and multidisciplinary groups, and really trying to understand and pick apart what's driving this, how much of this is racism, how much of this is cultural misunderstanding, how much of this is microaggressions or inability to access services. And it's only by doing that that we can then start to try to understand how we can respond to it. So I think that you've got 2 options. You can either despair, or you can say, this is really atrocious. But now we've seen the problem, we've got to start thinking about how we're gonna try to improve it. And I would choose to look at the latter. And of course, that's the disparity in the UK, but you can talk about the global disparity of maternal health, which is, as I say in the book, and as a friend of mine says often, is the humiliation of the modern world, right? The difference between being a girl born in Sierra Leone versus a girl born in Sweden, your chances of dying in childbirth are huge. But it's a lot better than it used to be. Doesn't mean we don't have a long way to go, but there is potential for hope, because we know that we have the skills to improve things if we choose to. And that's, of course, where the political and economic will comes in. It's not, as often the case, it's not necessarily down to the clinicians, it's down to the real decision makers. But we can guide them, we can advocate, and we can work with our populations.
I have 2 questions. First is whether the BBC or Netflix has approached you, because honestly, I'm completely serious. I think that this story needs to be told to the mass media so that people are aware of what's happened, and the reflection of the COVID Ebola thing was very, very well done then. And I don't think we've learned the lessons through COVID. So that's the first question. The second question is specifically about abortion access, and maybe for Michaela as well, in your context of, and Ben, both of you having worked all over the world. I have a specific interest in what's happened to abortion access in the US. And my wonder is, has that ruling had a positive impact? For example, in Mexico now, women are having more access to abortion. Or has it a negative impact in certain countries, i.e., well, you know, in terms of religious kind of fervor and looking to the West and looking to the US and emulating certain things? What's your opinion about abortion access and the effect of that?
Okay, well, the answer to the first question is very short. So thank you very much. Thank you for your very encouraging feedback. No, the BBC and Netflix have not approached me. If anyone knows anyone, feel free to tell them how great the book is and how important it is. That would be wonderful. And then in answer to your second question, maybe I'll let Michaela go first because I'm
Well,
hiding in the
I
spotlight.
don't feel like, no, I mean, it's fine, it's your subject. I don't feel I know enough about it. I thought there was a fascinating article in the New Yorker in which they're describing what's happening in the US with all these sort of underground networks of women passing, you know, the abortion pill from state to state, you know, people who are in states where it's still legal, or crossing borders, carrying it and administering it. So I think, you know, the human ingenuity and that will be spreading around the US is quite inspiring, but of course it's horrific that it had to come to that. I don't have a sense of what's going on here, I'm afraid, at all. Yeah.
Right. So I think, as Michaela said, the first thing is obviously what's happened in the US is absolutely atrocious. And it's a stain on us as a global society, and it's certainly a stain on the US that this is the situation they find themselves in. But as far as the impact that it's had, and I'm sort of looking because I know behind you we have some of the BPAS who please, you know, add in. But I would say just from my perspective, I see it in two ways, because I think that it's clearly had some negative impact, but I think there are circumstances where it's had some positive impact outside of the US. And maybe if I talk about the positive, it's that it has really brought this discussion. You know, we spoke about sexual reproductive health issues often being silent and hidden, but it's been headline news repeatedly. It's brought this discussion into meetings and into rooms and in front of people that would normally shy away from it, that normally would not have to engage with it. And it's actually made people who maybe didn't feel particularly passionately about this subject suddenly feel passionately, because they're thinking, well, if it's happened in the US, could it happen here? And like you said, you know, there are a lot of groups now who are focusing on self-care and empowering women to be able to access safe abortion care through the post or through underground networks, through telephone services. And a lot of those decentralized models are not only going to be used for restrictive settings, they're going to be useful everywhere, let's be honest, you know. But as much as it's emboldened some people, the negative consequences are that it's also emboldened those who are anti-abortion, because for them what they're seeing is, well, hey, they can do it in the US, maybe we can do it here. And so we absolutely cannot let our guard down, even in countries where we feel we have good freedoms, because there are people who will see this also as an opportunity for them to curtail those freedoms and to bring in restrictions. But one good example of positive from this is Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone has a very restrictive legal framework on abortion. Essentially, it's illegal, which is why they're estimated that, you know, about 10% of maternal deaths in Sierra Leone are from unsafe abortion, although it's probably much higher because it's hidden. But they are now in the process of pushing through a bill. It's called the Safe Motherhood Bill for slightly dubious religious political reasons, but essentially it's a bill for safe abortion care. And one of the reasons that they had cited for pushing this up the agenda was because of seeing what has happened in the US. But, you know, this is very much a silver lining on a very dark cloud. But I don't know if is there anything that you would like to add?
It's really easy to fall into the trap of it all being doom and gloom. I tend to find myself personally agreeing with you that I think I feel positive. I mean, particularly when you see the advancements we've had in abortion care in this country with the government that we have, you know, with the right-wing government we've had, you can take both abortion pills at home now since 2018, two separate things. We haven't got telemedicine. We've really shifted to this demedicalized way of providing care, and that's all in the context of this shift to the right. And so I think it's important for us to remember, you know, if we can do that under the conditions that we have, the world's our oyster. But I would say as well, we're getting more more mainstream organizations are treating abortion as the mainstream healthcare thing that it is. You know, over 200,000 women and people in England and Wales have an abortion each year. But it's only until recently that mainstream research organizations are funding it like any other healthcare provision. You know, so I feel positive. That's probably super naive.
And actually to add to that, I think politically it had a positive impact in the US in the sense that it was this last set of elections where the Democrats were not, you know, they thought that they were going to lose some of the seats. They actually retained some of the seats and they gained more. So I think that, and absolutely the notion of abortion really was key, was one of the main platforms people say.
It's true, it got the women out to vote who might not have bothered.
So just going back to that previous question about global disparity in access to health, and what we saw a very similar thing in monkeypox when the disease which was endemic in Nigeria, when it affected the white man, that was when the vaccine was rolled out, and everyone started talking about it, and paper after paper came out. Was it similar with Ebola, that when the Westerner got it, that the vaccine was out, or anyone thought about treatment?
Okay, so just for anyone who couldn't hear the question, it was going back to the global disparity in healthcare, and the example given was looking at mpox, you know, monkeypox, and how, you know, this has been endemic in West and Central Africa for a long time, but it only really seemed to be that people sat up and paid attention once it started affecting people in high-income countries, and whether or not during Ebola, there was the same disparity in access to vaccines. So not specifically vaccines, because the vaccine came later and was trialed and largely trialed within the population that was most affected, which was local populations. But there was a lot of controversy and challenges when it came to experimental treatments. And at the beginning of the West African outbreak, as I said, there was no known treatment for Ebola. So it was supportive care, which is sort of fluid, nutrition, good luck. But there was a medicine that was thought could be curative. But there was only, I can't remember exactly, but I think there was only about 7 doses available in the world. And so that medicine, once the decision was made to use it, nearly all of those doses went to international aid workers, and that was and still is, you know, appalling. However, subsequently, with the other experimental treatments as they came through, because they were coming through in larger doses and in trial conditions, that disparity was much less. Although it's hard to say, because there was also very few international aid workers who got infected. Of course, the vast majority of people who got infected and died from Ebola were not those from outside, they were the local population.
Maybe can I take advantage of my role and ask a question as well? Maybe to both of you. I mean, it's mainly for Benjamin, but I think Michaela might have some views on that as well. And probably it reveals my origin as a political scientist. So Benjamin, you were very clear the function of humanitarian organizations to go in a country and support the government, not to replace it. But sometimes supporting the government might mean criticizing particular officials, practices, something, you know, and that's the way that you help in those situations. But that's obviously a perennial question for humanitarian organizations. What's your take on this?
Well, I think you have to look at it as a trade-off, because when you're talking about humanitarian response, you're also talking about access. So you need to ask yourself, how important is your humanitarian access to the population you're serving? Because if you criticize, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't criticize, MSF is very well known for criticizing, and it's within our objectives that we set for ourselves to to speak out. But it comes at a price, because that speaking out can result in having your access reduced or closed. And so you need to weigh up what's going to save the most lives. Am I going to be able to reduce the most suffering and save the most lives by working with this government and maybe speaking out internally and advocating to them directly? Or am I going to have a better chance by speaking out externally and saying, look, this is what's happening, this is a disaster, and having it splashed on the front page of the newspapers, but knowing that the result of that might be that you're going to be kicked out of the country. And one of the ways that that can be navigated is remembering that you're not the only one in the room. There's a lot, as Michaela's already said, there's lots of international aid organizations. And so it might be that one aid organization speaks out, but has already worked out with a couple of others that they're not going to. So that, you know, the International Committee of the Red Cross might be very much still in place, but MSF might take the hit. And so, you know, you have to work within the situation that you have before you.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would broaden it out. I've written a lot about aid in my books, and I am a skeptic and a critic of aid. I mean, in most of these crises, there's a very high political quotient. Less so with an earthquake in Haiti, something like that, less so with a disease, but there will still have been an element of politics in that the government concerned can't cope with it because, you know, there'll have been sort of problems with incompetence or corruption or mismanagement or funds going, you know, getting stolen, being spent on a road to the president's palace. But the case in which the emergencies which the political quotients are most obvious are things like the famine, you know, Ethiopia's famine. We are currently experiencing a famine in Tigray, and it's completely politically caused, just as it was when Bob Geldof was raising money. It's famine is used as a tool by governments to starve areas into submission and to cut off support and you know, supplies to rebel movements, guerrilla movements in the areas concerned. So in every crisis, there's always a huge amount of politics. And I think, you know, I've become increasingly skeptical about aid. I like many people who are skeptical about aid, we tend to feel you have to respond to the humanitarian crisis in the immediate. You know, when you've got refugees pouring into a country and there's no food and they're all catching cholera, you have to respond to that. I am very critical of aid, but my criticism is mostly for long-term development aid, which strikes me as massively undermining the sovereignty and purpose of governments in place. You know, so often the British government, you know, it used to be DFID, now it's part of the Foreign Office, will be very proud of the fact that they're providing education or health facilities, you know, funding them in huge swathes of the world. And you kind of think, but, you know, the governments in the political parties in those countries are running for election and telling their voters that they have delivered, you know, healthcare and education. And so you're severing a link. Your accountability becomes more and more meaningless in those countries, because if NGOs or, you know, the World Bank or DFID, as it used to be, or USAID are providing those services, what on earth are the governments in place doing? Why are they there? And on what basis are they campaigning for electoral success? So, I mean, I have a real problem with long-term aid now, but I think most of us would agree that when you have a humanitarian crisis, you know, that's what we would like our aid to be spent on, responding to that. But there are plenty of people who would also say that that's very dodgy as well. I don't think any of the answers are easy.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions, then I have only 3 things to do. The first one is just to remind you that if you're interested in other events on global health, go on the website of the Global Health Initiative at MSc and just kind of sign up for the mailing list. The second one is to tell you that there are some wonderful books over there, so please on your way out stop. The third thing is just please join me in thanking Benjamin Michela so much for her wonderful talk and very insightful talk. Thank you very much.